Okay, we're gonna do a walkthrough of tattooing this tattoo design from start to finish, and I'm just gonna talk about tips or tricks or the things that I'm thinking about as I'm going through tattooing this flash design. First and foremost with this design, I am going to use an 11 round liner. This is one of my favorite sizes of needle cartridges for pen machines. It is different if you're using coils, so an 11 on a coil would be much bolder than the 11 in the needle cartridge. These ones are from Mast. These are the Mast Pros, and the machine we're using is the Bronc X2. This is one of their newer machines that has the adjustable stroke. So it ranges all the way from 4 to 2.6, and for lining, we are going to leave it on 4.0 millimeter stroke. Something pretty important, I feel, is making sure you let your stencil dry. I let this dry for 2 days, but typically I would just always want it to be drying overnight at least, so that the stencil isn't going to wipe away. Actually, on the contrary, it's going to be hard to get off, but I think that is better when you are learning to tattoo than losing your stencil. And I'm just using this Amazing Colors super rich black. I don't think using any sort of specific inks on fake skins makes the difference or not as to whether they're saturated or anything like that. So I'm not a big stickler on which ink I'm using, nor with cartridges when I'm practicing on fake skins. So I'm gonna run it at 8.5 volts to line this design. I know it's gonna be hard to see from there. I always have a little Vaseline. This is to help the ink not stick on the fake skin. It makes it easier to wipe away. Also, it helps the needle glide in and out of the skin. So I'm always going to apply a small amount of Vaseline to the fake skin before I start tattooing. And when I go to dip ink, I only dip the needle that is protruding from the cartridge into the ink and let the needle pull the ink up into the ink reservoir. And that's really all the ink that you need. A couple seconds in that ink is going to fill enough in the reservoir, and this will also help with ink pooling or spitting. Always have a paper towel to wipe away as you're working as well, and I just usually keep that in my stretching hand. And something that's really important when you're starting out is practicing stretching the skin when you pull your lines. So where this is going to be my first lines that I'm going to pull down here, because I always want to start in the lower right hand corner and work my way up this way. That is to preserve the stencil if this was on a real client, because if I was to work this way and down, I will be working on my stencil the entire time, and the chances of wiping it away are much greater. And so really stretching the skin, let's be honest, it's not that important on fake skin. It's not going to affect anything. But I do think it's really important to be doing it and practicing it so that it's muscle memory when you do end up tattooing on a human canvas. And once you finish pulling a line, you just want to dab the line. I mean, you can wipe again, but it's just to preserve the stencil, because if the stencil was fresh on human skin and you wiped away every line, it's going to wipe your stencil away off of the skin. Not to mention, it causes less trauma to the skin to be dabbing after a line than to be wiping every line. I tend to pull my lines, so I'm always angling the machine in the direction I'm going. I guess not always, but 99% of the time, if I'm pulling a line like this, my machine is angled away from me, and I'm pulling the line towards me, keeping the same sort of angle with the needle the entire line, if at all possible. If you go doing lines and the needle's getting all crooked in the skin and stuff, you can cut people. So it's also just a good practice to get used to, so that when you do transition to human skin, you won't have issues with cutting people. I'm realizing now, most of the things I'm gonna say are probably gonna be more so about real skin, as in real human clients, but the things you should practice on fake skin so that when you get to a human client, you're much better off. One other thing I focus on a lot when I'm pulling lines is I put a lot of the weight into the palm of my hand and I pull from my elbow. Whenever possible, right? Like there's times when you're going to use your wrist a little bit, you're doing circles, things like that. You can't pull a circle with your elbow, unless it's a really big circle maybe, but yeah, a lot of the times when I pull a line, I'm pulling like this from my elbow, planting my palm into the surface of the work area and letting my arm guide the needle. I'm like letting the machine do the work and my arm is just guiding it along. This will help with stability in your lines. Now, if your lines aren't coming out saturated, the problem is going to be you're moving too fast for the voltage that you're running. I know that this speed works well for me. At 8.5 volts, my hand speed leaves the lines saturated. But if yours are undersaturated, you'll just want to adjust your voltage to better meet your hand speed. One prime example of that is if you are moving too fast, you want to just move your voltage up. If you're running 7 volts, try 7.5, try 8. Move at the same hand speed that you were before. And once the line is saturated in one pass, you'll know that you have your hand speed dialed in with your voltage. I always notice that the first few lines just aren't as good as the next lines, and progressively throughout the tattoo, you just get more comfortable and more confident. And I find that, I can tell from right here, this was a long pull line, went in multiple directions. It's much cleaner than the first lines we did. So, don't just get discouraged on your first line. Just keep practicing. This takes a long time to get really good at. When I first started, a lot of people would say, like, don't rotate your fake skin to do your lines, but I would argue that if that's going to help you do a clean tattoo, and if you're working on getting comfortable, just pulling your lines, I think it's okay to do that. At a certain point, you'll realize you don't need to flip your skin anymore because you're comfortable pushing lines, pulling lines, going from side to side. So as the time progresses and you get better, that's something that'll just come naturally, from my experience anyway. So don't feel bad if you want to rotate your skin because you're going to get the right angle and pull a little better line than if you didn't do that. And so I think the main way that you're going to get clean, consistent lines is moving at a consistent speed and a consistent needle depth. And you'll understand that the more you practice. But it's just something to think about as you're going through these tattoos is you just want to move ever so slightly, but maintaining that same speed throughout the entire pull of the line. You don't want to go fast in one spot, slow in another spot. You don't want to go too deep in one spot, not deep in the next. So yeah, that whole practicing of those few things and getting those dialed in will yield you with really great line work. Now let's say you have a line that is super long and you're not going to feel comfortable pulling that whole line in one pass. Once you get to the point where you're starting to feel uncomfortable, you just want to take off like an airplane out of the skin. Now, when you come back to finish that line, you want to back up and you want to come in a little early. In the same area you were coming out of the skin is where you want to be going into the skin to finish the line. So I'm going to do that here as an example just to show you, but I always err on the side of caution where if I'm pulling a line and I start to feel uncomfortable, like I might get the shakes or I might bump or move a little weird and mess up the line, I literally just always whip out and come back in, because sometimes you try to power through those and you might end up doing one of these or one of these and you can't go back. When the line's in there, it's in there, so better safe than sorry in my opinion. So I just touch the needle to the skin until I see a little dot. I make sure I'm ready to go. I'm comfortable with the direction I'm going, and maybe even running the line on your own like this before you do it could be helpful as well. But yeah, I just make sure I get super comfortable. I'm stretching the skin. I'm touching the needle down to the fake skin until I see the ink pooling ever so slightly on the top. And then we're gonna go into the fake skin and start our movement. Nice and smooth. And we'll just pretend here's the place where we're uncomfortable. We just wanna lift up and whip out. So now this area of skin, you're going to see that it goes from darker to lighter. That's the whip out of the line. So when we come back in, we're actually gonna start further up here, come back into the line so we can seamlessly connect the two lines so that when it's all finished and done, it looks like it was one line. So we'll just back up from where we whipped out. We'll come in ever so slightly, just barely touching the top, and then finding our way into the proper needle depth, and we will finish pulling this line. All right, looks pretty good. It looks pretty clean. It looks like it was done in one pull. Now these circles here, these are one of those areas where I'm not gonna be able to pull with my elbow. It's gonna be more of a wrist motion, but I am gonna try to avoid bending my wrist as much as possible just so that the lines are consistent. But one thing I like to do, I'll just get rid of that for now, is on my stretching hand, you can sort of rest your pinky or you can rest against your index finger, whatever. You can find stability by finding multiple points of contact. So we have the heel of our hand, maybe the pinky of this finger, as well as something resting against our stretching hand. It just gives us 3 points of contact, and it'll just make the line smoother in the end. And the more you practice that, the better you'll get. But I'm gonna go ahead and do one where I'm sort of resting on my thumb and see how this helps me with stability. It's not perfect, but it is helpful. You can see that this line is pretty smooth. I think where I came into the line here a little bit, it's not fully saturated, but that just means that I wasn't deep enough in the skin for it to fully saturate it. So no problem if that does happen. Just going back over those areas and just lightly grazing the top of it to fix that. You don't want to go over it more than a couple times because you will likely cut the skin. And if you do get to the point where your fake skin is really messy, you can put some Vaseline on it, and if you massage it in a little bit, it will come right off and you start back with a clean fake skin. The stencil isn't going to come off, however, so my trick for that is using a little bleach, putting a little piece of paper towel on, pour a little bleach on. It'll eat off any of the remaining stencil once you are finished with the outline, and then you can go ahead and shade the design. But you can also just not let it dry as much and it'll come off. But at this point within the tattoo, we would have lost the tattoo because I'm tattooing up top. I am working my way from right to left, but at the same time, I'm pretty certain we would have wiped away a majority of the stencil already had we not let it dry overnight. I remember the time when I actually started nailing my lines and they were nice and smooth, and it all just hinged on the fact that I would really lean into my points of contact, because the more points of contact I had and the more stable I was, the smoother my lines got. And as you're probably noticing, I am just pulling a lot of the time towards me, keeping the same angle, keeping the same depth, and pulling along my palm, because it just creates a lot of stability in your line work rather than, doing stuff like this. That's just not going to give you nice, smooth, clean lines. There's going to be a lot of times when you're tattooing too, and the stencil is just a guide. If you go out of the lines of the stencil a little bit, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to affect the outcome of this tattoo. Now, if you're doing something that's perfect, like geometric, squares, circles, things that are actually perfect with the line work, then sure, the stencil is basically the law. But in this sort of situation, you can go off the stencil a little bit. Just don't panic. Just keep true to the movement that you're already in so that everything looks natural and looks clean. I wouldn't suggest trying to get back on the line, because then you're just going to create a jump in the line or inconsistencies in your lines. So this machine does have a timer on it. This outline has taken us about 40 minutes. That's how long the machine has been running anyway. And I feel like I went over all the little tricks and tips that popped into my mind. But if you are watching this and you have questions that I have not answered, please leave a comment down below and I will do my best to answer all of the comments. And I think the biggest tip I could realistically ever give you is that confidence is key. So the more you practice and the more confident you get at tattooing, the better your designs and your tattoos are going to turn out, because you go into them much more confident. And I know that's not something that everyone wants to hear, because you're going, well, I'm not confident yet. So how can you just say, well, be more confident and your tattoos will be better? All I'm really saying is practice more, practice often, make it feel like second nature when you're tattooing, so that you just disappear into the process. And that's when you'll notice your confidence start to rise, because you are now killing your tattoos. And then it'll all make sense, because you'll think, oh wow, I'm actually confident now and my tattoos have gotten better. Sounds like all I needed to do was practice as much as possible. And especially since we're learning on fake skins, dip it and rip it. Get in there, do the tattoos. You got nothing to lose. You're not putting a bad tattoo on any person's body for the rest of their lives. So just have fun with it. And with time and practice, you'll just get better. Okay, so when I'm done with the outline, I like to use a little bit of my Vaseline, rub it into the skin. Sometimes you just kind of have to massage it in a little bit to get all this ink worked up off the fake skin. And from here, you can just wipe it away and it should wipe fairly clean, except for the residual stencil, which I mentioned earlier. So we are going to put some bleach on this. I'll show you how to do that, and then that'll be the end of this video. I will be making a second video to go over the shading and any tricks or tips that come to mind while I'm working on that. Okay, and to do this, I'm just gonna take a paper towel and place it over my fake skin. Going to take some generic bleach, and I'm gonna pour it over the top until it soaks into all areas of the tattoo. You don't really need more than that. You just want the tattoo stencil itself to be fully immersed in the bleach. So that's probably plenty. Might just use my glove to spread this around before I toss my gloves away anyway. Okay, so then I just come back and check. I'll just lift this up and check this every 15 minutes, and eventually you'll come lift it up and the stencil will just be gone. You can take it to the sink, wash it with some soap and water, and then we're ready to shade. So I will see you in the next video for the shading.